Don't you dare lecture me like you're my mother when you're not even my real mom. Get out, you parasite. One evening, after coming home late from overtime work, I found that my daughter, who had been living alone, had returned to our family home. She and my husband seemed to be in a bad mood because they had been enjoying talking about me behind my back, and I had just returned home. It's no surprise. Until now, the two of them had treated me almost like a slave. Still, there was something important I had to tell my daughter, so I ignored her complaints and proceeded with the conversation, only to be bombarded with grievances from my husband. This is my house. You're useless, a waste of space. Get out now. My daughter agreed with him and threw my belongings into the gutter. I never imagined that my daughter, whom I had raised with care, would do such a thing to me. I couldn't believe it, but after being treated that way, I saw no reason to cling to this house and left as they told me. Living alone was comfortable, and when I stopped sending money to my daughter, cracks began to form in the once solid relationship between her and my husband, leading to an unexpected downfall in their lives. I married a man with a child. He was a widower, and it was my first marriage. When I met my husband, he was a man doing his best to raise his young daughter on his own. I was drawn to his earnestness and the overflowing love he had for his daughter. Despite my parents telling me that there's nothing wrong with marrying a divorced man but questioning if I, a first-time bride, could raise a child that wasn't my own and warning me about the challenges of parenting, my decision was firm. I frequently met and interacted with my husband's daughter during our courtship, and we got married after deepening our bond. Our life as a family of 3 began after our marriage. My stepdaughter quickly grew attached to me, never acting spoiled but often seeking affection. I wanted to continue working after marriage, so we decided to have a dual-income household where we shared household and parenting responsibilities. My husband kept his promise, and despite opposition from my parents, I was content with the happiness of having followed my own will. Then, I discovered I was pregnant. I was nervous as it was my first time, but my husband had already experienced childbirth with his late wife. I reassured myself that he would be my support. When I told my parents about the pregnancy, they were happy to see me leading a blissful married life. They apologized for speaking ill of my husband and stepchild, and though our relationship was mended, I still felt hesitant to rely on them. However, just when I thought my husband and I could support each other through life, something unexpected happened. As soon as my pregnancy entered a stable phase, my husband's attitude changed drastically. Now that you're in the stable phase, there shouldn't be any problems with the baby or you, right? So, you're gonna pay back all the housework and childcare you skipped while claiming morning sickness. He then pushed all the household chores and childcare, which we used to share, onto me. Furthermore, he started saying that since I'm home all day on maternity leave, I should be the one doing the housework, and he began drastically reducing his time at home. Every time he saw me, he complained and criticized my housekeeping. If I showed even a hint of dissatisfaction, he'd raise his hand and threaten, "Are you talking back to your husband?" Although he never actually hit me, the fear of a man raising his hand made me shrink back. I knew this wasn't good for the baby inside me. The thought of divorce crossed my mind many times. Being pregnant and on maternity leave wasn't an obstacle to divorce. I had the confidence and financial means to raise my child alone if needed. But what would happen to my stepdaughter if I left? She had grown very attached to me, and the desire to raise her myself grew stronger, so I chose to stay and live with my drastically changed husband. I couldn't bear to leave my young stepdaughter with my current husband, fearing for her well-being as both a person and an adult. Once I decided to become her mother. I couldn't let her lose her mother again, so I decided to endure and raise her, even under these circumstances. Later, I gave birth to my son safely. I planned to take maternity leave even after my son was born, but my husband started contributing very little to the household expenses. The amount he provided was nowhere near enough for a family of 4 to live on. When I asked if he would at least cover the children's educational expenses, he said if they were necessary, I should work and pay for them. As my son was gearing up to start elementary school, I realized things just weren't going to work out with the way they were. I gave up my leave and went back to work. Dropping my little boy off at daycare, I worked my fingers to the bone. The last thing I wanted was for my kids to suffer just because their parents didn't make enough dough. I was dead set on avoiding any kind of financial disparity caused by our earnings. So, I started stashing away every penny I could spare for my kids, instead of spending it on myself. I was hoping to hand it over to them when they grew up, just in case they ever found themselves in a bind. This was actually something my folks did for me. On my 20th birthday, they gave me a bank account, saying it was the money they'd socked away for me over 2 decades. I still hold on to it, never having touched a dime. Money's not everything, sure, but in my eyes, it's a clear sign of parental love. My kids kept growing up strong and healthy. Coming home late from work to find they'd already gotten dinner ready, waiting for me, was the best feeling. My husband was still as unpredictable as ever, a ticking time bomb, really. But the love and affection from my kids made all the hardships seem like nothing. Then came the teenage years for my daughter, and boy, did things change. She started getting influenced by stuff she heard from outside and began her rebellious phase. "You're not even my real mom. Stop bossing everyone around like you own the place, just because you got dad to leave." My husband's absences got more frequent, sometimes not coming home at all. My daughter seemed to think I was the one driving him away. He had a habit of blaming me for anything that didn't suit him, so he probably fed her some story. Even with all that, I kept hoping we'd come to understand each other someday. But as the years went by, the gap between me and my daughter just got wider and wider. This continued even after she moved out for college. When she hit her last year, it was time for her to start considering her job. And that same year, my son got into a state university out of town and started living on his own. I kept sending them both money every month, as my husband was barely chipping in at home. My earnings were the only thing keeping their allowances going. Even after it was just me and my husband, the money he brought in was barely enough to cover our utility bills, let alone groceries. I ended up footing the bill for all our living expenses. The house, which used to feel a tad snug with 4 of us, now felt hollow with just the 2 of us. My husband and I didn't talk much, and when he did, it was usually to take out his frustrations on me. When my son was home, I could distract myself with conversations with him, but now, there was no escape. I couldn't stand it anymore, watching my husband use up the groceries and household items I bought with the money I earned, like it was his right. More and more, I found myself thinking about divorce. One night, after working late, I came home to find the house unusually bright. I knew my husband was home, but then I heard my daughter's voice. She had mentioned something about celebrating her new job at a big company that morning, but it looked like they'd gotten home before me. It was rare for my daughter to be back, but they didn't seem to notice my arrival and were busy bad-mouthing me. They must have been loosened up from the dinner and drinks they had without me. I could have just left them to it, but I had something I needed to talk to my daughter about, so I went into the living room where they were gossiping about me. Seeing me, they were shocked for a moment, but then my daughter got defensive. "What? You got a problem? Can we talk calmly for a second?" "Huh? I've got nothing to talk to you about. I talk to Dad about anything important. Just go away." She grabbed my work bag and threw it into the small pond in our yard through the open window. I couldn't believe she'd go that far and just stood there, shocked. My husband and daughter started urging me to leave. I thought, maybe I should just go if they're telling me to. I'd been thinking a lot about divorce anyway. When I glared at my husband, asking, "So, you really want me to leave?" He cowered. My daughter got even more upset seeing him back down. "Why are you getting cold feet, Dad? Haven't you been the one paying for everything for me, living in this house, and even sending me money now? This woman is just a useless burden, right? That's what you told me." "I see." So, my husband had been telling these things to my daughter behind my back. Wanting to show off in front of my daughter, he insisted that what she said was true. I was appalled that he could say such things right in front of me. Moreover, my daughter had twisted the truth about the financial burdens I had kept silent about, interpreting it in a way that suited her. She thought that all the school fees, tutoring, and trendy clothes she could buy at will were all thanks to my husband. When my son entered high school, he started working part-time, saying he would earn his own pocket money. He even tried to contribute a little to the household expenses, saying it wasn't much. Seeing this, my daughter should have understood that we weren't as well off as she thought. But my husband had said that it was too dangerous for a girl to work part-time, and that he would give her the money, so I complied. Additionally, I wasn't too keen on the idea of a high school girl working late at night. The reason I gave her as much pocket money as her classmates who worked was because my husband wanted me to. It was all possible because I managed the household budget to make it happen. I was disgusted by their attitude, taking everything for granted without understanding the situation. I realized there was no point in saying anything to them anymore. I told them I was leaving and placed the divorce papers in front of my husband, already filled out on my end. He seemed surprised when I mentioned this. I had been carrying the divorce papers, ready for when I made up my mind. I packed only the essentials in my travel bag and left the house. I put the bag that was thrown into the pond into a plastic bag and called a close friend who had always been there for me. I have a habit of putting my smartphone and wallet in my coat pocket. Especially when I'm in a hurry, I tend to do it without thinking. Today, after an unexpectedly long day of overtime work, I rushed home and did just that. Luckily, I have a habit of keeping my phone and wallet in my coat pocket, especially when I'm in a hurry, which saves my valuables. My friend immediately said she would come over. I called a taxi and contacted my son during the ride, telling him that it looked like a divorce was imminent. He said, "You finally made up your mind. It's for the best." Upon reaching my friend's house, I opened up about everything. My friend, who listened silently, then said, "You finally decided to divorce, huh? About time." Then she shared some news with me. I stayed at her place for a few days, but I soon decided to find a new place to live and move out. I returned to the house I had lived in to gather my belongings. I wanted to keep the visit short and also settle the divorce, so I returned with a lawyer. I had told my daughter to come home that day as I had something to discuss with her. My husband and daughter were flustered to see me with a lawyer. In front of my husband, I presented evidence of all the expenses I had covered for my daughter, from school fees and extracurricular activities to her current allowance. Seeing the bank statements showing withdrawals from my income and the household budget since I started living with my daughter, my husband started sweating and looking uneasy. My daughter quickly realized that my husband had been bragging and lying, and she glared at him with contempt. My husband, despised by my daughter, began to shrink further. "Dad never contributed financially, I get that. But that's all in the past. I've landed a job at a major company, so I won't need to rely on you anymore. Let's call it even," she said, adding that it was an adult's responsibility to care for a minor, and it had nothing to do with her. I hadn't shown her these expenses to get repayment. Her defiance was within my tolerance. I just wanted to prove that I was the one providing financially. Since arguing with her would get us nowhere, I acknowledged her wish to consider it settled. Then, I confronted my husband about the alimony. He brazenly denied any wrongdoing that would warrant alimony. However, I had started recording his verbal abuses and rants at a certain point. I had also kept a diary for a long time, noting down the days when he treated me terribly. As I played the recordings and showed him the diary, he recognized some incidents and eventually started covering his ears. It seemed even my daughter couldn't bear my husband's numerous mistreatments anymore, as I could sense hostility in her gaze towards him. "I never thought you'd be the one to say we're getting a divorce. I really do love you. I just didn't know how to show it, and, there's this thing where you end up teasing the ones you love. That's what it was," my husband tried to explain. In my mind, I sarcastically thought, "How old are you again?" Such an excuse might work for a grade schooler, but a man nearing his 50s? "I haven't changed my feelings. I've been devoted to you since we met. I love you. Let's start over. This time I'll pamper you to the point you might get sick of it." Listening to him, I felt like gagging on his cringeworthy lines. I firmly said, "No, my mind is made up," which made him suddenly change his tone. "A woman should just cling to a man. Women exist because of men." He kept spewing misogynistic statements, looking down on women. When I told him I was recording, he seemed aware that this wasn't compliant with today's standards and quieted down. "What I just said. I wasn't myself. Sometimes another personality of mine emerges. My real intention is always that I love you." Whether it was his real personality or not, both were equally creepy. I could see he was desperate to change my mind about the divorce, but everything he said only made things worse. If he really didn't want a divorce, I had a condition. "I know you've never really given up your gambling habit. Your previous divorce was because of your gambling and debts, right?" He begrudgingly acknowledged I'd done my homework. My daughter, learning for the first time why her biological mother was no longer around, lashed out at him in disbelief. Putting aside my daughter's grievances to be addressed later with her father, I proceeded with our divorce discussion. "I might reconsider the divorce if you agree to cover all future living expenses. But remember, if you miss any payments, you won't have meals and might even have to leave this house." He raised his voice. "This is my house. Being kicked out of my own house is absolutely absurd. If that's the case, I'll divorce you." In a fit of pride, he not only signed the divorce papers but also agreed to the alimony. It was a typical action driven by pride from my husband, but for me, it turned out to be a conveniently favorable outcome. A few months later, I received an unusual call from my daughter. Speaking in a very sweet tone, asking me to restart the allowance. Her father had apparently turned her away, telling her to earn her own living now that she had left home. Since she had already secured a job, finding time for a part-time job shouldn't be difficult. But if she was in a tight spot without working, I suspected there might be a reason. "Did you lose your job offer? Or are you so busy with job hunting that you don't have time for a part-time job?" In fact, on the day I was forced out of my house and stayed at my friend's place, she informed me about my daughter's job hunting. My friend worked at a major company. And it turned out my daughter had applied there and apparently got an offer. However, the day before I was kicked out, my son had shared some shocking information. He knew my daughter's social media account and occasionally checked what she was up to. He didn't approve of her attitude towards me and wanted to help in some way. That day, he saw a post where she bragged about securing her job offer by flirting with the HR manager. I had intended to discuss this with her, but I was kicked out before I could. As a result, we never had the chance to talk about it. If my daughter had talked about this earlier, she might not have had to struggle with job hunting. If she had declined the offer obtained through flirting and restarted her job search honestly, I would have wished to be more involved and support her. After being kicked out, I debated whether to tell my friend about this but eventually decided to share everything. The reason is that if my daughter were to secure a job through seduction, she would be the one to suffer in the end. It was in my daughter's best interest to lead an honest life, even if I had to be harsh. My friend, upon hearing this, looked up my daughter's social media account. There were pictures of her with a middle-aged man, presumably the HR manager. Although his face was not shown, his suit and build resembled the HR manager, and my friend saved these posts and images as evidence. When reported to her superiors, it became a serious issue, leading to an investigation of the HR manager. My daughter had indeed initiated some very inappropriate actions, and in return for these favors, he had forcefully included her in the hiring quota. The quota was already set, so her inclusion meant someone else was unfairly rejected. When asked how he decided whom to reject, the HR manager reportedly said it was based on whether the women were to his liking or not. His evasive responses to questions about whether he had done similar things in the past suggested that my daughter's case wasn't the first. This became a serious issue, leading to the HR manager's immediate dismissal. Naturally, my daughter's job offer was rescinded. The incident quickly became the talk of the industry. In fact, during job hunting seasons, some parents brazenly approach companies, offering money to secure jobs for their sons or daughters. But even if they succeed, the person only ends up struggling in a position that's beyond their capabilities. I can't understand the mentality of those who try to take the easy route into a job like this. It wouldn't be surprising if companies started sharing information to avoid hiring individuals who resort to bribes or seduction. My daughter's situation was a case in point. Following this, as I imagined, she was repeatedly rejected in document screenings at other companies. She probably reached out to potential sources for financial support, fearing she wouldn't find a job by the time she graduated from college. "Why do you know about this? Did you orchestrate the cancellation of my job offer?" She accused me, her emotions wildly fluctuating between anger and tears. She claimed it was necessary to resort to seduction to compete and later broke down. Fearing an uncertain future, even hinting at dire thoughts due to her desperation. While I understand that both crime and devaluing life are troubling, I felt I had done enough for her. I wondered if she really expected me to be swayed by her sudden change of attitude after all her disdain and entitlement. Well, that's tough. But remember, you're the one who said not to act like a mother since we're not blood related. Besides, I'm divorced from your father, so we really are strangers now. You're an adult, it's time to stand on your own feet. I told her flatly, devoid of emotion. Realizing I was serious, she became more desperate, trying a softer approach. "Didn't you save up money for me? I want that. That savings was for my daughter. You're not my daughter, and that money is already allocated for buying a new home. It's not available anymore." She then screamed at the top of her lungs in frustration. Are you kidding me? If I act submissive, you just get more arrogant. Demanding money repeatedly. It became clear to me that this was her true nature, an irredeemable person unable to change or return to good intentions. Disgusted, I quietly ended the call. After the divorce, my ex-husband continued his gambling habits. He lost everything, including the alimony, in an underground casino. Got entangled with dangerous people. And ended up arrested during a police raid. When contacted to take responsibility for him, my daughter refused. His attempt to involve a seemingly tough subordinate backfired, exposing his debts and casino involvement, leading to his demotion and eventual resignation after rumors of his bad associations spread. When clients say they won't deal with a company that employs such a person, the company has no choice but to send him to work at a subcontractor. However, word of what my ex-husband had done spread even there, making it uncomfortable for him. Eventually, I heard through mutual friends that he voluntarily resigned. Now, he's apparently on the run, trying to evade the massive debts he accumulated from his losses at the underground casino. But I suppose this is just the consequence of his inability to quit gambling catching up with him. My daughter, fixated on landing a job at a renowned company, graduated without securing employment. She moved to a cheap, rundown place. The walls are thin, letting in the neighbors' conversations, drafty gaps bring in the cold, and the creaky floor seems like it could give way at any moment. It's a rundown apartment. She's apparently working part-time jobs, but her strange pride causes issues with other employees, leading to her not being able to hold on to these jobs for long. Eventually, she reached out, seemingly wanting to apologize, but it turned out to be another ploy for money. Feeling that it was good to have taken a step back, I thought maybe I could lend an ear to my daughter's story, at least for a little while. I decided to cut off all contact for her own good and for my peace of mind. I've made sure she doesn't know my new address and blocked her number. I thought it would be better for my daughter's independence to maintain this distance. Since my divorce, I've had a personnel transfer, so even if my daughter comes to my workplace, she won't be able to meet me. Just to be safe, I've made sure that no messages from my daughter get passed on to me. With all this, my work has become my main source of fulfillment. As for me, I've found a new purpose in my work and enjoy the peaceful scenery of my new home. Financially liberated from supporting my ex-husband and daughter, I feel more relaxed and consider spending more on myself. My son even offered to take me on a trip with his earnings, giving me something to look forward to. Nowadays, I'm living my days to the fullest, cherishing my newfound independence and tranquility.